I'm a postdoc at the Faculty of Agriculture working with Dr. Travis Esau. Over the past 2 seasons, we've been fortunate enough to be able to evaluate this piece of equipment. I know many people have been asking about it and how well it works, et cetera. Hopefully, we can give you a little better picture today. And so the first thing we looked at was just sort of a basic yield trial comparing the new 5-foot head versus a traditional 3-foot, and then also with hand raking, not necessarily on a field efficiency basis, but more so on the berries are there, is the 5-foot head picking all the berries that the 3-foot head would get. So we used 164-foot swaths and just compared the mass of the harvested berries. For this trial, we used 3 different fields of various conditions. The first 2 fields, were fairly, I would say, standard plant heights and fruit zones, right around the 7 to 8 inch range for plant height. Fruit zone, again, in that 6 inch range from ground level. And then also the big thing with those first 2 fields is that they're essentially, at least in Nova Scotia, about as flat a field as you could expect. Big difference between the first 2 fields is going to be the average yields. Both, I would say, in Nova Scotia, fairly high yielding fields. One of them really incredibly high yielding. First field at 5,900 pounds the acre, and then the second field at 9,500 pounds the acre. If you're getting more than that in Nova Scotia, that's pretty impressive. And so that was the first year of data collection we did, but obviously, right, most of our fields don't look like that. We wanted to test in something a little bit more adverse. What you'll see in that third field is, I think, a condition that a lot of people will have experienced this year. Much taller plants, much branchier plants. I'll let the plant people tell you why that is. Certainly while I was picking, it seemed like the plants were taller than they'd ever been this year. Also in that field, much slopier, right? So it was, slopes up to 17% in that field. So certainly much more challenging for, that wider, rigid picking reel. Average yield in that field was around 4,600 pounds to the acre. So just a quick video of the system in action. This is from one of those flatter fields. This is the field that was around 5,900 pounds to the acre. Big thing to note in this video, and you'll see it a lot better when the camera operator comes around to the back side, is that, at least in my estimation, it's picking a pretty clean berry. And from what I can tell, it's not really a whole lot different from what you would expect with the 3-foot head in those very flat conditions. You'll see it here when he comes around. Which is certainly encouraging. I know I had my own biases going into this project. I definitely thought that we weren't going to see comparable picking performance, even in the flat. And so, to see this sort of thing was definitely encouraging. You'll see there, I mean, yeah, it's missing a handful of berries, but you're going to get exactly the same thing with the 3-foot head as well. But for the most part, we're getting the majority of the berries there. And so the yield data that we collected also confirmed this. I mean, there was quite a bit of variability within the trial areas. And so in terms of statistical difference, there's not a lot to separate the data. If you use sort of your own intuition, I think we'll all know that as good as the mechanical harvester gets, it's certainly not going to get more berries than hand raking is. But obviously, good luck finding, a single person who's going to go out and hand rake, let alone enough people to replace a harvester. Compared with the 5-foot and the 3-foot head, the 5-foot actually, even surprisingly, had more yield. Actually collected more yield than the 3-foot head. Why that is most likely down to random variability in the trial areas. So the main takeaway being, the 5-foot head isn't performing worse than the 3-foot head. And so what we also found is that the slope in that third field really didn't even make much of a difference. And so in comparing the 5-foot with the 3-foot head, that slope variability, again, as I say, did not impact the results whatsoever. What I will say is that 17% average slope is a fairly continual slope. It is some off camber, it is some uphill. It is not necessarily that condition that we'll see in many fields where, you know, you have a rolling field or you have changes in slope within the 5-foot width. It is consistent slope variation, all right? Something to certainly note. I know many people will have those fields that are very rolly, and even within the width of a single harvester pass, you know, you're going to expect some pretty significant slope variability. That condition we haven't tested, largely down to the fact that I think without having tested it, I think you'd cause some pretty significant damage to the head right away. Again, we don't have data to support that, but if that is what your fields look like, this probably isn't going to be the head for you. So at least in terms of theoretical harvesting time, how much more efficient could the 5-foot head possibly be? You'll see that I'm using 0.7 miles per hour as sort of the baseline travel speed for this harvester. You really have to keep the travel speed fairly low. And again, even 3-foot head in high yielding fields, this is really how slow you should be traveling. If you're an owner operator, if your goal is to get every single berry off the field, you really should be traveling at these lower travel speeds. We have definitely noticed that when you pick the travel speed up, even on the 3-foot head, you're going to miss more berries, especially in high yielding fields. And so at least theoretically on a 10-hour day, the 5-foot head, you can anticipate getting around 4 acres harvested. Compared with the 3-foot head, is going to get you about 2.5 acres harvested. Again, purely theoretical. But if you do increase the travel speed, maybe you're in a lower yielding field, maybe you have some shorter plants and it's a little easier to go a bit faster, you can expect that efficiency to improve somewhat. The 5-foot head is also about 4 inches narrower than a double. And so, at least theoretically, you are going to be slightly less efficient than the double. However, right, we also wanted to make sure that that was in fact the case. And so we did set up a field efficiency trial to evaluate that. And what we're looking at in this trial, essentially we had the 5-foot single harvesting, we had the double harvesting all at the same time. And we were assessing all of the stoppages. Anytime you weren't harvesting, how does the 5-foot head compare with the double in terms of total uptime? And also we assessed yield in this trial as well. And so when we say we checked everything, we really checked everything. Every time you weren't picking, we noted it down. A lot of these factors that you'll see up on the list have nothing to do with the harvester head. They're more down to the individual operator. And so the things that we're mostly looking at then become cornering, manual debris cleaning, and your actual time harvesting berries. The 5-foot single, as you can imagine, does corner slightly quicker on average than the double. There's just less to manipulate, but also those of you that have run both singles and doubles, a single is just a little bit easier to get lined up on your next pass, right? Your line of sight to that outside track wheel is a little bit easier. You're manipulating less equipment, and therefore it does ever so slightly corner a bit quicker. But the big difference, right, and you'll see it in the plot here, really does come down to how much time you waste getting out of the tractor to clean debris when you're running a double. Again, this is from the owner-operator perspective. It's not necessarily how many contractors are going to harvest, but if you own the land, if you want to get every single berry, if you want to make sure that you're picking as efficiently as possible, this is how we treated it and how often you should be getting out of the tractor to clean debris. The field we were picking in was, for Nova Scotia, I mean, as clean as it can get. It definitely had hair fescue, a bit of dogbane and a bit of goldenrod. Hair fescue was certainly the biggest concern in this field, but by no means was it among the worst in the province. And nearly 10% of the time you're in the field and you're supposed to be working, you are outside of the tractor, pulling junk out of the harvester head with that double. You compare that to the 5-foot single, and you bring that down to around 1%. Why is this the case? The big reason, and anybody who's run a double will be familiar with this condition, I'm sure. And I'll preface this by saying this is stock configuration. I know many of you will have double configurations that try to accomplish something that prevents this scenario. But at least the stock configuration, this is what you can expect, right? That front head throws debris into the back head, into the conveyor of the back reel. It's completely unavoidable, especially this year with the taller plants. And I'm sure many people will have experienced pulling more plants this year and having this sort of condition come up more and more often. And while I don't want to harp on the contractors, many contractors will just ignore this and keep picking. The reality is, and it may be difficult to see from where you're sitting, there's berries being thrown on the ground here, all right? If you don't get out, if you don't clean that out, you're going to be throwing berries on the ground. And obviously anybody who owns their field, is picking their own field, is not going to be interested in doing that very often. And so what we found is with the double harvester, it's about 10% of your total time in the field that you're spent out of the tractor clearing that debris, all right? The single, obviously, doesn't have that issue. You spit the debris out the back, there's really no problems. The only times that I was stopping with the 5-foot single is if, again, maybe even this year specific problem, pulling plants and having those plants get stuck in the teeth. That was really the only time I had to stop. And then in terms of how they compare from a yield perspective, and again, remembering that the double-headed harvester is 4 inches wider, all right? And so you would anticipate that 1-to-1, the double can harvest more berries per hour than the 5-foot head. However, our data shows that that's really not the case. Yes, obviously the means are different, but the statistics tell us that this is not a significant difference, all right? The 5-foot and the double effectively will pick the same number of berries per hour. Again, largely down to the amount of time you spend stopped with the double-headed harvester. Again, if you're just plowing through and you're not going to worry about that, we don't really have that data. But if you are harvesting, if you are taking care to make sure you get every berry you can possibly get, you shouldn't expect any difference in terms of the amount of berries you can harvest per hour with the 5-foot head compared with the double. So let me just grab a here. The next thing we looked at this past summer was a new picker bar design. Because of the various reasons, the traditional picker bar design doesn't really work for the 5-foot head. There's a lot more stress that's placed on those picker bars on the 5-foot head, as you can imagine, right? You move that lever arm further away from the motor and you get much more stress on those outside teeth and the outside portion of that bar. And so DB came up with a new picker bar design in order to accommodate this larger head. Whether this is the design of the future, I'm not sure. You'll have to speak to them about that. Whether this will be available on 3-foot heads, again, I'm not sure. But at least for the 5-foot head, we did run a comparison in terms of how much yield recovery you can expect with this new picker bar design, and then also how many plants is it pulling compared to the current picker bar design. So there's sort of a side-by-side of the two picker bars. And in a lot of ways, they're fairly similar. It may not look like it from the image, but the profile of the teeth is identical between both the new and the current picker bar. The big difference is how they're mounted and what they're mounted to. And so on that new bar, the longer bar in both those images, you actually are mounting the teeth to a piece of round stock, whereas in the traditional bar that we'll all be familiar with, it's on a piece of square stock. In addition to that, right, when we look at the new bar, the teeth are actually inset into the bar. They're not necessarily within the bar like they are on the traditional or the current picker bar, which also has some benefits we'll talk about in a minute. So in terms of yield, we didn't really, again, get any significant difference. With any work in wild blueberries, you do have to take all of your data with a bit of a grain of salt. Just because you get so much variability from plot to plot, it does sometimes skew your statistics a little bit. At least what that's telling us in this case is that there was no difference in terms of yield. The means at least tell us, yeah, that the 5-foot bars did have more yield, but not necessarily significantly more yield. For whatever that's worth. Again, I can talk about again in a minute why this is likely the case. But at least 1-to-1, we don't really see any significant differences between the two designs. And then again, with plants pulled, I think this is the one that's probably the most misleading. Again, due to the variability in the samples, the statistics tells us there's no significant difference. I have run both these bar designs. I can tell you with 100% certainty, the new bar design pulls way less plants. It doesn't even feel close when you're behind the wheel of the tractor. It's apples and oranges in terms of how many plants you're pulling and how often you're stopping to pull plants out of the teeth. This will seem like a crazy amount of plants to be pulling. What I'll say is this is the worst field I have ever been in for pulling plants, and it wasn't even close. Incredibly tall plants, incredibly branchy plants, very, very shallow rhizome, and a really, really gravelly soil throughout the entire field. It was like you could reach down and just pluck plants out of the ground with your hand like it was nothing. And so we definitely pulled a ton of plants. But again, what I'll echo is that new picker bar design, for me, in the cab of the tractor, you're definitely stopping way less to deal with plants. You're definitely pulling less plants with the new design. And so with this new design, then there are a lot of pros that come along with it. One of the big ones, and you'll see it in the image there, is just how much easier it's going to be to replace a single tooth with this new design. You know, in a lot of cases, right, with the traditional design, you're gonna be breaking a tooth or two, and then you're thinking about replacing the entire rake in a lot of cases, right? It's not necessarily that simple to go in and replace single teeth effectively with the traditional design. With the new design, right, anybody with a grinder and a welder can grind out the old piece that's left in there, pop a new tooth in, weld it in, right? That's gonna represent, you know, obviously a big cost savings when it comes to replacing a single or two teeth as opposed to replacing the entire bar every time you snap a few off. The second thing to note, despite the fact, and I will say this is very noticeable from the operator's perspective, despite the fact that the teeth are the same profile, you can definitely get closer to the ground with the new picker bar design. And that's because of where the teeth are located relative to sort of the point of rotation on the reel. They are a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch closer to the ground each time they come around. Again, it's very noticeable. When we were picking in that 9,800 pounds of the acre field, very short plants, tons and tons of berries. In a lot of cases, berries sitting on the ground. With the traditional bar, right, we were just leaving a blue carpet behind. We certainly still weren't getting all of them with the new bar design, but it was definitely doing a lot better job. So if you are in fields that have very, very short plants, this new bar design does allow you to get ever so slightly closer to the ground. And finally, as I mentioned, despite what the significance of the data tells us, it definitely pulls through dense vegetation a lot better, especially what we saw this year, again, with the tall and branching plants. Just down to the fact that that traditional bar design, being that it's all welded to a piece of square stock, right? When the plants come through and encounter that piece of square stock, it is much more of a pinch point. It's just rougher on the plant. It doesn't deflect the plant nearly as well as the piece of round stock does. And so, I definitely found much less reel slowdown in really dense vegetation or in weedier areas. We got a lot more reel slowdown with the traditional bar design. And we also, in my opinion, pulled a lot more plants with the traditional design. So some additional considerations with the 5-foot head. So this is obviously a purely theoretical calculation, and it is done from an absolute worst case scenario perspective. But when we think about that outside track wheel on the blueberry harvester head, depending on how your field conditions are, it obviously does crush berries. If you have really tall plants, if you have low yielding fields, you're probably not crushing that many berries. If you're in 10,000 pounds to the acre with really short plants, you're probably crushing every single berry that wheel comes anywhere near. And so thinking about, again, this is a point of comparison mainly between the 5-foot and the double. A lot less of the area or the effective picking width is covered by that track wheel with the 5-foot head than it is with the double. It's about 3.5% for the 5-foot head and a little over 6% for the double. This is perhaps the biggest benefit of the 5-foot head. If we think about how much the 5-foot head weighs, it's about 1,800 pounds. The double is about 2,550 pounds. What that means is you can use a much smaller tractor and, as the data shows us, be just as efficient from a picking perspective. So this is the harvester tractor we use. It's a John Deere 5085. This tractor, this size chassis cannot run a double harvester effectively. It's just too heavy. You'll get into big problems if you get into any off camber or anything like that. However, for the last 2 years, we've been running the 5-foot single on it. I have had what I'll say is no issues. Obviously, like anybody, you know, you get on a steep slope or a little bit off camber, you're going to expect a little bit of sliding. Definitely more than a 3-foot. It is 600 pounds heavier than the 3-foot, and so yeah, there's a little bit of sliding. But apart from that, I haven't noticed any issues in terms of the weight and running it on a tractor this size. As we know, right, with the price of tractors these days, as you go up in chassis size, as you go up in horsepower, right, linear increases in horsepower are usually exponential increases in price. And so the ability to, you know, run this harvester on a much smaller and a much cheaper tractor and still expect pretty comparable results to the double is definitely encouraging. Right, some of the stuff we've worked on in the past, again, just to echo that, it's only going to increase the benefit to you as the farmer, increase your efficiency. If, right, being more efficient on your blueberry farm, whether it's harvesting, spraying, whatever, the best investment you can make is auto steer. It is a massive efficiency increase for any operation that can benefit from it. And I guarantee you, and some people won't like hearing this, there is nobody in the room that can outperform the auto steer systems. Even entry-level auto steer systems, you cannot beat them. You might be able to beat them for 10 seconds to a minute. You cannot beat them over a 10-hour, 12-hour, 14-hour day. It is impossible. I know people won't like hearing that, but you definitely can't do it. This is data from me harvesting. Full focus for very short periods of time. And my average discrepancy, again, ensuring that I don't miss any berries, is about 4.5 inches off. You compare that to John Deere's freeware entry option, their SF1 correction signal, it's about 3.87 inches off. SF3 comes in a little under 3 inches off. If you've really got lots of funds available and you go to an RTK correction, you can definitely expect near centimeter accuracy in terms of how efficient your auto steer can be. The difference in 1.5 inches over single pass or a single field may not be enormous, right? But you extrapolate that out to an entire picking season, and it's going to save you many hours across that entire season. Another thing you'll hear people talk about, especially when it comes to harvesting in a lot of cases, definitely a lot more often in years past, has been minimum speed cutout and the fact that auto steer stops working at these slower travel speeds. I have used both the John Deere system as well as the offerings from Case IH, and I have had no issues harvesting wild blueberries at as slow as 0.7 miles per hour. John Deere is advertising as low as 0.5 miles per hour. And so I can't imagine many people are harvesting any slower than that. So certainly I don't believe this is an issue if you have a modern GPS system. The other thing to note with the 5-foot head compared with a double, it is definitely, it's without a doubt, and we don't have exact data on this, but it's definitely far less actions per minute or inputs that you're actually putting into the control box per minute than the double harvester. And so just echoing some data that we've shown here in the past in terms of how reducing your APM translates to operator stress, translates to fatigue, translates to operational errors. We found that auto steer reduced operator heart rate by 11%, having an automated head adjustment reduced heart rate by 7%. And so all of this, again, over a short period of time doesn't necessarily matter that much, right? But when it's over 3 weeks to a month of your picking season, it's definitely going to reduce the number of operational mistakes you're making on the farm. All right, so just to conclude, without a doubt, the flatter your field, the better it's going to be. We did test, again, on those slopes up to 17% and didn't have too much issue. So when I say flat, I mean consistent slope variation. So again, it's not necessarily going to be that great if you have really rolly terrain. And again, that major slope variation within a single pass of the harvester head is what I'm talking about there. A double, because it's got that one inflection point in the middle, is going to track that type of land better than the fully rigid 5-foot single is going to. But if your slope variation is fairly consistent across your entire field, it's definitely going to pick well for you. Again, personal experience, but it definitely picks better in less dense, shorter plants. I mean, I've heard people saying that they like the taller plants because you don't have to necessarily you don't have to worry about getting into the ground. I guess I can understand that. For me, from a picking efficiency standpoint, shorter plants, less dense plants, it's always going to be easier to pick. If you're not gonna have to get out of your tractor to clear out debris nearly as often. You're not gonna have to deal with any potential real slowdown. It's definitely, for me, a lot easier to pick in those less dense conditions. And what we found is the 5-foot head definitely performs better in less dense vegetation than it does in what most Nova Scotian fields ended up looking like this year. One thing to note, the side conveyor does require some modification. If you're in really low yielding fields, maybe not, but it is pumping out, nearly twice as many berries on each rotation of the head. And while most of this system is plug and play with your existing boom system for the 3-foot head, my recommendation would be to modify the side conveyor to be able to handle that additional load that's placed on it. Before we modified ours, I mean, we were dumping berries off the side, especially in that 9,800 pounds to the acre field. We were losing berries off the side conveyor. As I mentioned as well, it's critical that you stick to proper travel speeds. If you get going too fast with this head, you're going to miss berries. You're going to leave that blue carpet behind your head. That's really not a whole lot different from the 3-foot. I mean, I know you've heard our group say it many times. Everybody wants to push the pace. I know if you have a lot of land, it's difficult to get across it before, the berries start to go soft and maybe even start falling off the plant, and you want to start pushing the travel speed. But if you want to be as efficient as possible, you should be sticking 0.7 to 1 mile per hour to be as efficient as you possibly can be. That is the speed these systems are designed to work at. That is what they pick best at. Final thing, I know we've had some growers ask us about this as well. It does allow you to pick in a block with a double as well. And so many people, I'm sure, are aware, if you're picking with a double and a single for most tractor chassis sizes in the same block, when that single drops bins, the double can't get by it on the next pass around, or the single can't get by it on the next pass around. And so what that means is if you need to drop bins in the middle of a pass, you have to pull out of that pass, drop the bins, pull back in the pass, and keep picking. We have some rough data on that. It's a little bit over a minute every time you need to drop bins that you're losing in terms of harvesting time. However, with the 5-foot single, it's no issue. You can drop the bins. You don't even have to stop harvesting, right? You just keep picking, drop the bins right where you're going. the double is going to have no issue getting by it on the next pass around. Just again, obviously a big advantage. All right, so that's really all I have for today. Again, if you're interested in anything our team is working on or myself, you can grab the QR code there. But otherwise, I'm happy to take any questions people have on this harvester design. Again, I'll just echo my personal recommendation. I've used it for the last 2 years. For me, it'd be pretty tough to go back to a 3-foot single, especially in the fields that we were in. It just, the field just seems to melt away at twice the rate when you're going around with it. It's pretty fantastic. So, yeah, thank you very much. And if you do have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
We get some time for some questions if anybody has any.